The Woman Pharaoh, The Rise of Hatshepsut. Good evening, my nocturnal historians. Prepare yourselves as we journey to the heart of the 15th century BCE, to the city of Thebes, at the core of a thriving and ambitious empire. Put on your linen robes and get ready to be lulled by the story of a woman who ruled like a god and built like a master. Our story begins with Hatshepsut, Egypt's master strategist, indefatigable builder, and an all-around gender-bending powerhouse. Hatshepsut was born in 1508 BCE in the city of Thebes to Pharaoh Thutmose I and his great royal wife, Ahmose. That title, Great Royal Wife, meant serious business. Ahmose was a queen, and her children had a real chance to rule. Little Hatshepsut was born into privilege, but more importantly, she was born with expectations. She was raised immersed in the Egyptian religious tradition, with daily lessons on mathematics and astronomy, temple rituals and mythology. She learned to manage estates, read and write hieroglyphs, and most importantly, how to play the game of power. From an early age, she was shrewd, observant, and politically savvy. But as a girl, her future was predetermined: to marry someone important, support his rule, and perhaps act as regent if he died young. And, of course, that is exactly what happened. To keep the royal bloodline intact, Hatshepsut married her half-brother, Thutmose II. Yes, today that raises eyebrows, but for the Egyptians it was standard procedure. The gods married their siblings, so why not the royal family? Hatshepsut and Thutmose II had a daughter, Neferur, who later became quite a significant figure at court herself. But Thutmose II was not a strong ruler. Sickly, unremarkable, and not particularly memorable, his reign was short and quiet. When he died, Egypt was left with a child heir, Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Egypt wasn't fond of being run by toddlers, so a regent was needed. And that's where Hatshepsut steps onto the stage. She stepped in first as regent for her stepson, but once she had a taste of power, she didn't stop. At first, Hatshepsut was just the face behind the throne, but over time, she began to take on more responsibilities. Official decrees were issued in her name. Temples were reconstructed under her command. The court realized she wasn't just watching over the throne, she was taking it. By the 7th year of her regency, she officially crowned herself pharaoh. Let's appreciate that audacity for a moment. Egypt had never seen anything like it. Sure, women had ruled before, but none had so boldly stepped into the full regalia of kingship. Hatshepsut adopted the royal titulary, dressed in male clothing, and even wore the ceremonial false beard. She wasn't pretending to be a man. She was redefining what a pharaoh could be. And just in case the people had doubts, she launched a PR campaign worthy of Madison Avenue. Reliefs, obelisks, and inscriptions declared her divine birth by the grace of the god Amun himself. She wasn't just a ruler, she was the embodiment of destiny. Hatshepsut wasn't content with just ruling. She wanted to leave something permanent behind. Her reign is marked by one of the greatest building booms in Egyptian history. Temples, monuments, and obelisks sprung up like desert wildflowers in spring. Her chief jewel is the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a grand terraced complex tucked against the cliffs of western Thebes. Known as Jesher Desheru, Holy of Holies, it is a masterpiece of ancient architecture, elegant, symmetrical, and grand without being vulgar. It served as both a tribute to her reign and a testament to her divine right to rule. Inside, it told her story, her divine conception, her coronation, and the peace and prosperity of her reign. The temple also paid tribute to the gods, especially Amun, to whom she credited her right to rule. A clever political move. If you can't beat the patriarchy, get the biggest god in the district on your side. One of Hatshepsut's most famous achievements was a trading mission to the legendary land of Punt. Imagine Punt as the ancient Egyptian version of Shangri-La, mysterious, exotic, rich in frankincense, gold, and baboons. Scholars still debate where it was located, perhaps modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. Hatshepsut sent a fleet of ships loaded with trade goods, and they returned with frankincense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, leopards, and exotic animals. This wasn't just economics, it was optics. Hatshepsut showed Egypt that she could deliver prosperity as the gods intended. The entire expedition is chronicled in elaborate reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, including depictions of the Queen of Punt, who was depicted as being generously proportioned. Let's just say the Egyptians were not shy with their chisels. Being a pharaoh is not only about incense and architecture, it's about keeping the court in check. Hatshepsut was surrounded by astute allies. Chief among them was Senenmut, her steward, architect, and possibly something more. Rumors have swirled for centuries. Was he her lover, her confidant, just a very ambitious bureaucrat? In any case, he was central to her reign. He oversaw building projects, tutored her daughter, and had statues erected in his honor, a rare privilege for a commoner. But power always creates tension. Certain factions at court likely resented her rule, especially the priesthood and the military elite, who preferred a male king. Hatshepsut navigated this carefully, maintaining traditional rituals and keeping her image firmly tied to divine favor. Around 1458 BCE, Hatshepsut disappears from the record. It's unclear how she died: old age, disease, or perhaps a bit of palace intrigue. But upon her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally got his chance to rule alone. And oh yes, he had a lot of feelings to work through. Sometime near the end of his reign, he launched a campaign of damnatio memoriae, or erasure. Hatshepsut's statues were smashed. Her name was chiseled off walls. Her obelisks were buried or walled up. She wasn't just written out of history, she was edited. But why? Revenge? Insecurity? A neat political cleanup? Most likely, it was about restoring the traditional line of succession and preventing the awkward precedent of women with an excess of power. Pharaohs are eternal, but apparently a fragile ego is just as long-lasting. Fast forward to the 19th century, archaeologists begin to find fragments of Hatshepsut's reign. A statue here, a carving there. Slowly, the picture of a much more significant ruler than the erasure suggested emerges. Then, in 2007, a major breakthrough occurs. A mummy found in the Valley of the Kings decades earlier, but never identified, is finally matched to a tooth found in a canopic jar bearing her name. And just like that, Hatshepsut was back. What did she leave behind? An empire at peace, a court more stable than most pharaohs could dream of, newly opened trade routes, architectural wonders, and most importantly, a redefinition of what power could look like. She proved that leadership is not about gender, but about vision. She wasn't trying to be a man, she was trying to be a great pharaoh. And she succeeded. Her story reminds us that history is not written by the winners, it is written by the survivors. And sometimes it takes a few thousand years and a dental exam to restore the truth. So as you bow your head, dear dreamer, remember Hatshepsut, the woman who rewrote the rules, carved her name in stone, and was then erased only to outlive them all.
Catherine the Great. Now, dear dreamer, we are heading north, far north, to the sparkling, icy halls of Imperial Russia. Prepare your fur chaise longue and get ready for palace intrigue, power grabs, Enlightenment philosophy, and a lot of horses. It is time for the saga of Catherine the Great, Empress, Reformer, and a masterclass in how to do it all while wearing a corset. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, our future empress was not obvious for world fame. She was a minor German princess from a minor German duchy. Her family was noble, but not particularly wealthy, and young Sophie was intelligent, headstrong, and deeply ambitious. She devoured books, studied languages, and probably scared away most boys with her intellect, a classic overachiever. Enter Russia. In 1744, Empress Elizabeth was looking for a bride for her heir, Grand Duke Peter. Sophie fit the bill. She was young, Protestant, but willing to switch teams, and had enough noble blood to pass the suitability test. So, off she went to court, where she converted to Orthodoxy, changed her name to Catherine Alexeyevna, and began her apprenticeship in royal Russian politics, which, spoiler, included a lot of behind-the-scenes intrigue and zero HR support. Her husband, Peter III, was not great. Clumsy, immature, obsessed with Prussia, and possibly mentally unbalanced. He liked to play with tin soldiers and ignore his wife. Catherine, on the other hand, was reading Voltaire, Machiavelli, and Russian history like she was preparing for a final exam. She was playing the long game, and Peter didn't even know there was a game. Fast forward to 1762. Empress Elizabeth dies. Peter III ascends to the throne and immediately starts burning bridges. He alienates the church, the military, the nobility, and probably the palace cat. Catherine, meanwhile, is quietly building alliances, gathering support, and looking exceedingly regal in public. Just 6 months into Peter's rule, Catherine makes her move. With the help of loyal guardsmen and a few key military lovers, yes, plural, she stages a coup d'etat. Peter is arrested, forced to abdicate, and dies shortly thereafter under suspicious circumstances. Catherine declares herself Empress of Russia, not consort, not regent, but autocrat, and she never looked back. Now that she had the throne, she needed to keep it. She positioned herself as an enlightened monarch, a proponent of reason, science, and all things French. She corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, and the other rock stars of the Enlightenment. At the same time, she knew how to play the autocrat's game. She expanded the nobility's power over the serfs, cracked down on dissent, and kept her secret police well fed. Catherine's politics were a bizarre mix of progress and repression. She modernized the administration, codified laws, and founded new cities with libraries and theaters. She saw herself as the mother of the nation, raising Russia from infancy to greatness. Was it propaganda? Certainly. But it was also reality. Her rule made Russia smarter, grander, and undeniably more European. By the 1790s, Catherine was aging but still formidable. She outlived her critics, her lovers, and most of her enemies. She was planning to bypass her unstable son, Paul, in favor of her beloved grandson, Alexander. But before she could make it official, she died suddenly from a stroke in 1796. Paul took over, immediately reversed most of her policies, and was assassinated 5 years later. Yet Catherine's legacy was intact. She ruled for 34 years, longer than any female ruler in Russian history, and transformed a semi-feudal province into an empire feared and respected across Europe. Was she perfect? No. Was she progressive? Sometimes. Was she ruthless? Often. But was she great? Undoubtedly. Catherine the Great defied expectations, broke the rules and changed her world. She didn't inherit her empire. She took it and then made it shine. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of the Crusade. Now, dear dreamer, we flash back to the Middle Ages, to a world of castles, crusades, courtly love, and power games. Settle in, because it is time for the saga of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess in her own right, and Mother of Kings. Eleanor was born around 1122 in Poitiers in the region of Aquitaine, a wealthy corner of southwestern France. Her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine, which made Eleanor one of the most eligible bachelorettes in medieval Europe. Aquitaine was massive, powerful, and rich with vineyards, castles, and poetry. It was the 12th century Napa Valley if it came with knights and siege weapons. Unlike most girls of her time, Eleanor was educated. She studied Latin, philosophy, music, literature, and how to run a duchy. When her father died when she was about 15, she inherited Aquitaine and suddenly became the most sought-after political bride in Europe. King Louis VI of France wasted no time. He quickly married her off to his son, Louis VII. Just days later, Eleanor was Queen of France. Louis VII was deeply pious, quiet, and serious. Eleanor was brilliant, outspoken, and not thrilled about spending her days in monasteries and sackcloth. She wanted festivals, poetry, and maybe a little conquest. He wanted prayer. It was not a match made in heaven. Still, Eleanor threw herself into it. She bore 2 daughters, advised Louis on political matters, and even joined him on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. That's right, she gathered her court, donned armor, well, modified armor, and rode across Europe and Asia Minor. And it wasn't just a ceremonial appearance. Eleanor commanded troops from Aquitaine and had her own retinue. Was it successful? Not exactly. The crusade was a disaster. The European forces were poorly coordinated and suffered from lackluster planning and logistics. The march was brutal. Troops faced extreme weather, famine, disease, and constant attacks. Their most notable action, the siege of Damascus, was horribly bungled and ended in retreat. But Eleanor's real moment of notoriety came when rumors flew that she had gotten too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. French tongues wagged, royal tempers flared, and her marriage to Louis began to unravel faster than a tapestry in a rainstorm. When they returned to France, their marriage was annulled. Officially, because they failed to produce a male heir. Unofficially, let's just say Eleanor and Louis agreed to seek other kingdoms. 2 crowns and the mother of rebels. Once free again, Eleanor wasted no time. On her journey home, she survived at least 2 kidnapping attempts. Yes, literally, attempts by noblemen to abduct and forcibly marry her to gain Aquitaine. She fended them off. In 1152, she married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and future King Henry II of England. He was 11 years her junior, fiery, brilliant, and seriously ambitious. Within 2 years, he was king, and Eleanor was Queen of England once more. This time, things were different. Eleanor was not just a queen, she was a co-ruler of one of the largest empires in Europe. Together they ruled England and vast territories of France. She bore him 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John, the one from the Robin Hood stories. But while they produced powerful children, their marriage was a raging sea. Eleanor and Henry's relationship soured over time, partly because Henry was a serial adulterer, and partly because Eleanor did not like being sidelined. She had ruled Aquitaine on her own. She was not going to fade quietly into the background. In 1173, she made her most daring move. She joined her sons in a rebellion against their father. Yes, you heard that right. She and her royal progeny started a full-scale revolt against the King of England. Eleanor was not going to let Henry command her sons or divide their inheritance as if it were his personal cheese board. Unfortunately, coordination was not their strong suit. The revolt fell apart and Eleanor was captured. Henry arrested her and imprisoned her for the next 15 years. But even in captivity, Eleanor remained a force. Her court in Poitiers had already become legendary as the birthplace of courtly love, where troubadours sang of knights and ladies. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor was released from house arrest by her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. Eleanor was in her 60s at this point, but she wasn't about to retire. While Richard left for the Crusades, Eleanor governed the kingdom in his absence. She negotiated ransoms, engaged in diplomacy, and suppressed rebellions. Even when her less glamorous son, John, took the throne, Eleanor played the role of royal peacemaker and political broker. She arranged marriages, forged alliances, and managed estates. She didn't stop until her final years, retiring to Fontevraud Abbey, where she finally died in 1204 at the age of around 82. That's an Olympic level of longevity for the Middle Ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not merely a queen twice over. She was an institution. She was a mother, ruler, diplomat, patron of the arts, and a political operative of the highest order. She wielded soft power and hard strategy. She helped birth a new culture of chivalry, poetry, and romance, and she did so while surviving political scandal, the fallout of a crusade, imprisonment, and more childbirths than most queens could bear. Queen Boudica. Now, dear dreamer, we head to the wild winds of ancient Britain, where a warrior queen once set the Roman Empire on fire, literally. Wrap yourselves in a wool cloak and prepare to meet Queen Boudica, avenger of injustice, the scourge of the legions, and the original rebel with a cause. Our story begins around 30 CE in the green hills of Britain. This was not the England of Shakespeare or stone castles. It was a land of tribal kingdoms, wooden palisades, iron swords, and fierce independence. Boudica was born into the Iceni tribe, who inhabited the area of modern-day Norfolk in eastern England. The Iceni were a proud people with their own customs, religion, and a deep distrust of outsiders. The Romans had been in Britain since 43 CE, led by Emperor Claudius. The Romans brought roads, taxes, and legions. The Iceni played along, sort of. Prasutagus, Boudica's husband and the Iceni king, cut a deal with Rome to keep his kingdom semi-autonomous. It wasn't love, it was a compromise. Boudica was queen by marriage, but she was not just a figurehead. She was trained in the warrior traditions. Think of her as a spear-wielding head of state. She and Prasutagus had 2 daughters, and together they tried to maintain the fragile peace with the Roman overlords. When Prasutagus died around 60 CE, he tried to secure his family's future with a compromise. He left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero. In theory, it was a diplomatic gesture. In practice, it was a time bomb. The Romans completely ignored the will. They declared the Iceni land their own, moved in, confiscated property, and treated the locals like rebellious slaves. Worst of all, in a public spectacle designed to humiliate, Roman officials scourged Boudica with whips and assaulted her daughters. This wasn't just a political mistake, it was a cultural offense, a personal violation, and a declaration of war. The Romans saw it as a message: obey or suffer. Boudica saw it differently: fight or die. Boudica did not retreat. She did not beg. She did not wait. She began to organize, to gather the tribes. In the tribal world of Britain, loyalty was complex, often based on kinship, honor, and vengeance. Boudica had all 3 factors on her side. The Trinovantes, long oppressed by the Romans, joined first. Others soon followed. This was no longer just an Iceni battle. This was a revolting Britannia. She addressed her followers not merely as a queen, but as an outraged mother, a dishonored leader, and an indigenous person standing up against a foreign invader. The power of her story united thousands. According to Roman sources, her army grew to almost 100,000 people. Boudica dressed in a multicolored tunic, a thick cloak fastened by a brooch, and wore her famous long red hair loose over her shoulders. She carried a spear, but her true weapon was her voice. She spoke of justice, she promised vengeance, and then she brought fire. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, fell first, a Roman city built on Celtic land. It contained the hated Temple of Claudius and a small, poorly defended garrison. The citizens pleaded for aid. Rome ignored them. Boudica's forces stormed the city. They razed the temple. They slaughtered the garrison. They showed no mercy to civilians. This was warfare, ancient and total. Word spread. Panic took root in the Roman settlements. Next was Londinium, the nascent Roman town that would one day become London. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, busy crushing the Druids in Wales, rushed back. He assessed the situation and abandoned the city. Londinium burned. Then Verulamium, modern St. Albans, the same fate. Tacitus estimates the death toll at over 70,000 people. Rome had not seen such a rebellion in Britain before. Boudica wasn't just burning cities, she was burning Rome's illusion of control. But Rome was stubborn. Governor Paulinus finally gathered his forces, perhaps only 10,000 men, but they were hardened legionaries, disciplined, ruthless, and organized. They chose the battlefield wisely, a narrow defile flanked by woods, with no room for Boudica's numerous army to deploy. It was a tactical trap. Boudica arrived with her army, tens of thousands strong, but poorly trained and ill-equipped. According to Tacitus, she addressed her troops from a chariot, her daughters standing by her side. She told them she was fighting not for wealth or conquest, but for justice and freedom. Then the attack came. Chaos erupted. The Romans held firm. Then they charged. The Britons broke. A slaughter followed. The carts, blocking their retreat, trapped thousands, and they were killed. The rebellion died in a single day. Boudica's fate is still debated. Tacitus says she took poison to avoid capture. Cassius Dio suggests she died of illness. Either way, she vanished from the battlefield, but not from legend. Rome reclaimed the land, rebuilt the cities, but afterward ruled Britain more cautiously. The brutal suppression was followed by gentler governance, an effort to integrate the tribes rather than wipe them out. Boudica lost the war, but she changed the rules of the game. For centuries, Boudica was remembered in Roman texts as a cautionary tale. Then, the Victorians discovered her. The Victorians suddenly reinterpreted Boudica as a national hero, a British freedom fighter standing up to tyranny. Queen Victoria was named in her honor. Statues were erected. Poems were written. She became the mythical mother of Britannia. The truth, of course, is more complex. She was a queen defending her homeland, yes, but she also led a brutal campaign of vengeance. Her story is raw, complicated, and human, and that is what makes it powerful.
Maria Theresa. Now, my dear dreamer, we travel to 18th century Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire, where Maria Theresa ruled a patchwork quilt of territories with stubbornness, grace, and an absolute lack of time for nonsense. Fluff your feather pillows, strike up the harpsichord, and prepare for court intrigue, military reforms, and some impressively headstrong child-rearing. Maria Theresa Walburga Amalia Christina was born on May 13, 1717, in Vienna, the capital of the powerful but increasingly unstable Habsburg Empire. Her birth was cause for moderate celebration, though true joy would have demanded a son. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, desperately seeking to secure the Habsburg succession, spent years convincing the major powers of Europe to agree to the so-called Pragmatic Sanction. This decree stated that if he had no sons, his daughter, yes, even a girl, could inherit the throne. He got the signatures, he got the promises, he got the assurances. But when Charles suddenly died in 1740, the ink might as well have been written in vanishing lemon juice. Maria Theresa, just 23 years old and pregnant with her fourth child, found herself the ruler of a huge, debt-ridden, multilingual empire and the target of every ambitious crown in Europe. The wolves were circling. Within hours of Charles's death, the War of the Austrian Succession began, and oh, what a mess it was! Bavaria claimed the imperial throne. France, smelling an opportunity, intervened. Spain wanted its piece, and, worst of all, Prussia, under King Frederick the Great, executed a lightning grab of Silesia, one of Maria Theresa's most economically valuable provinces. Maria Theresa was stunned, but not paralyzed. She summoned her advisors, rallied the troops, and, perhaps most impressively, gave birth during the opening weeks of the conflict. Now that's multitasking. In a dramatic appeal to the Hungarian nobles in 1741, she appeared in traditional Magyar dress, holding her infant son, and delivered a passionate speech, promising to protect their rights if they would protect hers. The famously prickly Hungarian nobility melted. They pledged their swords and their resources. Her response to the invasion was not just defense, she fought back. She allied with Britain, and though she lost Silesia, she retained her core territories and emerged from the war with her throne and her dignity intact. As soon as she had a moment to breathe, Maria Theresa turned to the business of empire building. She initiated broad reforms across her vast dominions. Her finance ministers restructured tax collection, finally forcing the nobility to contribute something other than opinions. She modernized the bureaucracy, turning the Austrian state from a clumsy nepotistic machine into a relatively efficient government. Maria Theresa also tackled military reform, expanding and improving the army that had been so painfully outclassed by Prussia. She established military academies and standardized training. Education was her passion. She introduced compulsory primary schooling for both boys and girls, a radical concept for the time. The goal wasn't just literacy, it was obedience, patriotism, and the dissemination of Enlightenment values carefully filtered through Catholic doctrine. Speaking of which, while influenced by Enlightenment ideas, Maria Theresa remained a profoundly devout Catholic. She suppressed Protestantism, censored books, and resisted many of the more liberal reforms that her son, Joseph II, would later push. She believed in reason, but also in hierarchy, order, and her divine right to rule. Maria Theresa did not only use armies and decrees, she used weddings. Oh yes, she used weddings. With 16 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood, Maria Theresa possessed one of the most potent diplomatic tools in Europe, the dynastic marriage. Every child was a pawn on her political chessboard. Her daughters were married off to princes and kings across the continent. Her sons were groomed for leadership. Her most famous match was Marie Antoinette, her youngest daughter, married to the future Louis XVI of France. We all know how that ended. But for Maria Theresa at the time, it was a masterful move. By marrying her children into rival dynasties, she could secure peace, build alliances, and project Habsburg influence far beyond Austria's borders. She micromanaged these marriages to an absurd degree. She wrote lengthy letters to her daughters, filled with advice, criticism, moral instruction, and the occasional passive-aggressive guilt trip. She expected piety, loyalty, and diligent performance of royal duties, not wild wigs and excessive baking budgets. Perhaps her boldest political move came in the 1750s with the so-called diplomatic revolution. For centuries, Austria and France had been bitter enemies, but with the rise of Prussia as a mutual threat, Maria Theresa flipped the script. In a move that stunned Europe, Austria allied with France. The unthinkable became reality. Enemies became partners. Marie Antoinette's marriage to the French Dauphin sealed the deal. This realignment led directly to the 7 Years' War, one of the first truly global conflicts. Maria Theresa did not succeed in reclaiming Silesia, but she held firm. The war ended without major map changes, but Austria emerged from it a resilient and reformed power. Her marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine was a true partnership. He was her co-regent, confidant, and emotional anchor. She loved him deeply, and when he died in 1765, it broke her. Maria Theresa never recovered from the loss. She wore black for the rest of her life, retreated from courtly revelry, and became more conservative. But she did not stop ruling. Her son, Joseph II, became Holy Roman Emperor, and she made him co-regent. They frequently clashed. He wanted radical Enlightenment reforms, she preferred cautious, controlled changes. He was all about ideals and urgency. She was pragmatism wrapped in mourning lace. Nevertheless, they worked together, always focused on strengthening the empire. Maria Theresa ruled for 40 years through war, scandal, grief, and constant challenges. She left behind an empire stronger than she found it, a bureaucracy more professional, and a populace more educated. She did not start as a military genius or a reformer. She became all of it through necessity, determination, and an unwavering sense of duty. Her reign laid the foundation for the modern Austrian state. So tonight, as the candles flicker in Schönbrunn Palace, imagine the woman sitting at a gilded desk, a quill in hand, writing the orders that would outlast her. Maria Theresa did not ask to rule, but once she had the crown, she never let it slip. She was not just the mother of Austria, she was its backbone.
Queen Victoria. Now we dive into the era that literally bears her name. Lace up your corset, pour a cup of strong tea, and prepare for the long celebrated reign of Queen Victoria, a petite woman with a colossal legacy, who ruled an empire upon which the sun famously never set. Victoria was born Alexandrina Victoria on May 24, 1819, at Kensington Palace, London. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, died before she was 1. Her upbringing was dominated by her German mother, the Duchess of Kent, and a controlling advisor, Sir John Conroy. They kept her isolated and under constant surveillance. This was called the Kensington system, and it was more of a royal leash. No privacy, no friends, no freedom, just tutors, protocol, and plots. What they didn't realize was that the little girl in the ruffles was quietly accumulating fortitude. When King William IV died in 1837, the 18-year-old Victoria ascended the throne. She was untested, inexperienced, but she knew exactly who she was. From the moment she took the throne, Victoria made it clear she would be her own master. Her first act was to move out of her mother's house and banish Sir John Conroy. Politely, of course. She was young but resolute. Her diaries show a woman fully aware of her responsibilities. She attended cabinet meetings, met with ministers, and developed strong opinions on national matters. With Prime Minister Lord Melbourne as her first political mentor, she learned fast. She also quickly became the face of a changing Britain. Industrialization was changing everything. Steam engines, factories, railways, the telegraph. The urban population was exploding. So was poverty, pollution, and unrest. Victoria didn't make the laws, but she symbolized stability. She represented continuity at a time when Britain was hurtling into modernity. And she had opinions, sharp, sometimes obsessive, but always heartfelt. Enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria met her German cousin when she was 16 and proposed to him 3 years later. Yes, queens do that. They married in 1840 and quickly became one of history's most effective power couples. Albert was more than a consort. He was her intellectual equal, her advisor, and for a time, her anchor. He modernized the royal household, promoted science and industry, and pushed her to support public works. Their love letters are filled with mutual respect. They had 9 children, a dynasty that would later be sprinkled across Europe like royal confetti. But Albert was not universally loved. He was a foreigner, serious, and liked to meddle in politics. He faced criticism, but Victoria fiercely defended him, calling him her angel in the house. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was devoted. And when Albert suddenly died of typhoid fever in 1861, Victoria broke. Albert's death plunged Victoria into a state of mourning that defined the second half of her reign. She withdrew from public life, wearing black for the rest of her days. For years, she was rarely seen in public. People began to wonder, is the Queen still ruling? But Victoria, being a paradox, ruled fiercely from the shadows. She read every dispatch, advised ministers, and managed a growing empire. She just did it in mourning clothes, with a broken heart and a steel quill. During this time, she grew close to her Scottish servant, John Brown. The relationship between Victoria and John Brown sparked rumors, gossip, and a movie starring Judi Dench. We still don't know the truth, but it's clear that Brown was her comfort and confidant, and that she didn't care what others thought. While Victoria grieved, the empire expanded. India was formally incorporated into the British Empire in 1858 after the Sepoy Mutiny. In 1876, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli made her Empress of India, a title she adored. She never visited the subcontinent, but collected Indian servants, artifacts, and languages like royal playing cards. Her empire spanned Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The British Navy ruled the seas. Trade flowed. So too flowed colonial exploitation, violence, and cultural erasure. Victoria saw herself as a maternal figure, benevolent, civilizing, divinely chosen. The truth, of course, is more complex, but in the minds of her contemporaries, she was the empire. Her name, face, and silhouette symbolized it. She wrote to viceroys, she advised generals, she brokered alliances with monarchs abroad. She knew the power of symbolism, and she used it. Victoria's children married into all the major European royal houses. They became kings, queens, and consorts across the continent. She was dubbed the Grandmother of Europe, but with family came drama. Her eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, was a source of constant worry. He loved parties, mistresses, and not doing what he was told. Unfairly, but passionately, Victoria blamed him for Albert's death. Albert had fallen ill shortly after intervening in a scandal involving Bertie's antics, and while the link was tenuous at best, Victoria seized on it. In her grief, she needed someone to blame, and Bertie's carefree manner made him an easy target. Her maternal love was fierce, but so was her disappointment. She never approved of his conduct. There were scandals, assassination attempts, court rumors, and political intrigues. Victoria met them all with iron resolve and a writing hand that rarely paused. She was prolific. Dozens of letters a day, diaries spanning decades. Her handwriting could intimidate ministers. Her opinions could sway governments. In her later years, Victoria became an institution. She ruled longer than any monarch before her, over 63 years. She became the symbol of British constancy and continuity. Her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was a global celebration. Crowds cheered, colonies sent representatives, the empire was put on parade, and the small, black-clad widow ruled it all from her carriage. By the time of her death, on January 22, 1901, she had outlived all of her contemporaries. Her death signaled the end of the Victorian era. A new century was dawning. Tonight, as the gaslights fade and the trains rumble quietly through the countryside, remember the Queen who wasn't supposed to rule, wasn't supposed to last, and ended up defining a century. Queen Victoria, resolute, complex, powerful. She grieved deeply, she loved fiercely, she absolutely ruled.
Nefertiti, the enigma of the Amarna age and the disappearance. Now, dear dreamer, we flash back 3,000 years to ancient Egypt, where a queen of mysterious beauty and unprecedented power changed religion, art, and the very idea of kingship. Light your oil lamp, sip some date wine, and meet Queen Nefertiti, the woman who vanished from history but never truly went away. Her name itself conjures an image of timeless beauty, mystery, and golden splendor. Nefertiti means the beautiful one has come, a name that sounds like prophecy and poetry merged. She burst onto the world stage around 1350 BCE in the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt during what is known as the New Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. Her lineage is obscure, though not for lack of curiosity. One popular theory suggests she was the daughter of Ai, a high-ranking courtier who eventually became pharaoh. Nefertiti was a woman of high rank and potent ambition. Her husband, Amenhotep IV, soon changed his name to Akhenaten, pleasing to Aten, and jettisoned Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of a single god, Aten, the sun disk. Nefertiti embraced the change entirely. She was not just beside him, she was part of the movement. Her name became Neferneferu Aten Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of Aten, the beautiful one has come. Together they moved the capital from Thebes to a desert location and built a new city, Akhet Aten, Horizon of Aten, known today as Amarna. It was to be their clean slate, their divine canvas, their sacred break from the past. In the art of this period, Nefertiti is everywhere. She is not a demure background figure, but an equal. She is depicted making offerings to Aten, riding chariots, smiting enemies, and wearing the royal regalia, including the blue crown typically reserved for pharaohs. This was a shared kingship. And in these reliefs and sculptures, we see something radical: emotion. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown in tender scenes with their daughters, playing, laughing, exchanging kisses. Royalty had never looked so human. The Amarna period didn't just change theology, it transformed Egypt's artistic language. Gone were the stiff, idealized forms. In came curves, softness, elongation. Akhenaten was depicted with a narrow face and full lips. Nefertiti is also depicted with an elegance, but with individuality. The art emphasized a kind of divine androgyny, a fusion of male and female attributes, possibly to reflect Aten's creative completeness. This new aesthetic produced some of the most iconic pieces of Egyptian art. Chief among them is the bust of Nefertiti, discovered in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, unfinished with a missing eye, but still perfect in its stillness. It wasn't just beauty, it was political branding. As Akhenaten's reign progressed, some records begin to suggest Nefertiti's role expanded even further. Her name appears alone on religious inscriptions. She performs kingly functions. There are even scenes in which she eclipses her husband in prominence. Then, around the 12th year of his reign, something strange happens. Nefertiti vanishes. No official death record, no grand tomb, just silence. Some scholars believe she died. Others propose she was elevated to pharaoh, adopting the new name Neferneferu Aten. She may have been a female ruler who served as a bridge between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. If true, Nefertiti was not only a queen, but one of the few women in history to wield the full power of the Egyptian kingship. After Akhenaten's death, the city of Akhet Aten was abandoned. The court moved back to Thebes, the old gods were restored, and the boy Tutankhaten, soon to become Tutankhamun, took the throne. Under pressure from advisors, he reversed his father's religious reforms. This process included what we now call damnatio memoriae,
the erasure of Akhenaten and his immediate circle from public records. Nefertiti was caught in this historical purge, but she was not forgotten. For centuries, Nefertiti remained a whisper in dusty scrolls. Then the bust surfaced, and interest exploded. Where is her tomb? The question haunts archaeologists to this day. Nefertiti's legacy is more than aesthetics or mystery. She stood at the center of one of the most radical experiments in religious and political transformation. She was a co-author of a cultural shift in a role traditionally forbidden to women. She was a queen, possibly a pharaoh, but above all, she was unforgettable. Tonight, as the moon sails high over the desert sands, picture the light of Aten reaching across polished alabaster halls. Picture the queen standing tall beside a god. Queen Zenobia. Now we ride out across the sands of the Syrian desert, where a queen on horseback dared to defy the Roman Empire at its peak. Prepare to meet Queen Zenobia, polyglot, philosopher, strategist, and the woman who built a kingdom too bold for history to ignore. Zenobia was born around 240 CE in the cosmopolitan city of Palmyra, located on the edge of the Syrian desert. Her full name, Septimia Zenobia, reflects her Roman connections. Palmyra was a unique place, an oasis city and trading hub that straddled the boundary between east and west, where camels laden with silk and spices from China met ships carrying goods from Rome. In this cultural melting pot, Zenobia was raised both Arab and Roman. She was said to have claimed lineage from the illustrious Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Educated from a young age, she was fluent in multiple languages: Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and possibly Egyptian. She read Homer, loved history, and rode horses like a warrior. In a world where many women were relegated to the background, Zenobia stood tall in the saddle, her eyes already set on empire. In her early 20s, Zenobia married Lucius Septimius Odenathus, the powerful ruler of Palmyra and a staunch Roman ally. Odenathus rose to prominence by helping Rome push back the Sasanian Persians. In thanks, Rome allowed him to rule Palmyra as a client king with near-complete autonomy. Zenobia didn't just marry into power, she shared it as a consort. She was politically active, engaging with advisors and attending state ceremonies. Together, she and Odenathus strengthened Palmyra's defenses and expanded its influence throughout the Levant. Zenobia, Empress of the Palmyrene Empire. But in 267 CE, Odenathus and his eldest son were assassinated under mysterious circumstances. With her husband dead and her son, Vabalathus, too young, Zenobia did what few women dared. She took the throne. She was regent, yes, but ruled as queen in all but title. The late 3rd century CE was a chaotic time for the Roman Empire. It was the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, a period of plague, economic collapse, and endless usurpations. Emperors came and went with the change of seasons. The empire was falling apart. Zenobia saw an opportunity. She moved quickly to consolidate power. She placed trusted advisors, including the brilliant general Zabdas, in key military positions. She strengthened Palmyra's legions, fortified her cities, and controlled the trade routes that fed Rome's eastern provinces. Then she began to expand. In 269 CE, her armies invaded Egypt, claiming it in her son's name. Egypt, the granary of Rome, was essential for feeding its population. Control of Egypt was akin to holding a blade to Rome's throat. Parts of Anatolia, modern Turkey, followed. Zenobia wasn't just defending borders. She was creating a new empire, the Palmyrene Empire,
independent and distinctly her own. Her court flourished. Scholars, philosophers, poets all found patronage under Zenobia. She was not merely a conqueror, but a patron of the arts, a city builder, a thinker among warriors. Rome was not slow to react. In 270 CE, Aurelian came to power in Rome. Known as a tough military man, he spent his first year quelling rebellions in the west. Then he turned east. Aurelian was not interested in diplomacy. He believed in the sword. Zenobia met his challenge with pride. She strengthened Palmyra's defenses. Her army, led by Zabdas, met the Romans in battle at Ime near Antioch, and then at Emesa. They fought bravely, but Rome's legions were relentless. Zenobia refused to surrender. Even as the Roman forces marched on Palmyra, she clung to hope. She attempted to flee east, perhaps to enlist the support of Persia, but was captured on the banks of the Euphrates and brought before Aurelian. Zenobia's fate after her capture is shrouded in legend. Ancient sources conflict. Some say she was paraded through Rome in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph, a war trophy. Yet even in chains, she is said to have held her head high. Others say that Aurelian, impressed by her courage and intellect, granted her a villa in Tibur, where she lived in comfort, and even remarried a Roman noble. Was she humiliated or honored, a prisoner or a guest? The truth may lie somewhere in between. What matters is that Zenobia endured. She was not executed, she was not erased, she was remembered. Palmyra was allowed to continue under Roman control briefly, but in 273 CE, it rebelled again. This time Aurelian destroyed it. Temples were pulled down, palaces burned. The golden city in the desert was reduced to ruins. Yet even in ruins, Palmyra remained a symbol of what it once was, a shining outpost of resistance, brilliance, and ambition. And at its center was Zenobia, the woman who dared to claim the power of Rome for herself. Her name became legend. She was a woman who thought deeply about her role in history. She once said, according to sources, that she sought not to overthrow Rome, but to rule it better. Her ambition was not destruction, but improvement. She believed in civilization, in learning, in governance. She saw herself not as a usurper, but as a legitimate sovereign. And that belief, that conviction, made her dangerous, not because she rebelled, but because she made rebellion look like justice.
See she, concubine, regent, and keeper of the dynasty. Now, dear dreamer, we journey to the forbidden city of Imperial China, where a woman started as a low-ranking concubine and ended up ruling from behind the throne for nearly half a century. Intrigue, reform, rebellion, and pure political mastery. It is time to meet Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who held a collapsing empire together with an iron will and jeweled hands. Cixi was born in 1835 during the Qing dynasty in Beijing into a respectable but not particularly powerful Manchu family of the Yehenara clan. She was not destined for greatness, at least not by birth, but from an early age she exhibited a sharp mind, a fierce intellect, and a quiet self-possession. At the age of 16, she entered the Forbidden City as a concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. Among dozens of women vying for the emperor's attention, she was given the title Noble Lady Lan. In 1856, Cixi gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, Zaichun. This immediately elevated her. It was the beginning of her ascent. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861,
Amid internal strife and foreign invasion, the 5-year-old Zaichun became the Tongji emperor. Though Cixi had no formal claim to power, she was the emperor's mother. In Confucian China, that meant something. Cixi was now an empress dowager, and her influence was just beginning. Upon the emperor's death, a group of 8 regents seized power. They viewed Cixi and the senior empress dowager, Xian, as mere figureheads. They were mistaken. Cixi, along with Prince Gong, the emperor's uncle, engineered a coup d'etat. In a daring and meticulously coordinated move known as the Xinyu coup, the regents were overthrown. Cixi and Xian became co-regents, ruling from behind a silk curtain. Literally, when audiences were held, they sat behind a screen while ministers knelt on the other side. Cixi proved herself a master of court protocol, using tradition to wield absolute power in a system not designed for female leadership. As regent, Cixi ruled through her son, but she was the actual decision-maker. She oversaw military reforms, restored parts of the capital, and modernized some aspects of the administration. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil wars in history, was still raging when she came to power. She helped support the campaign to suppress it. Although the Tongji emperor reached adulthood in 1873, his reign was short. He died in 1875 without an heir. Cixi made another bold move. She chose her nephew, Zaijian, as the next emperor. The 3-year-old was crowned as the Guangxu emperor, and Cixi resumed the regency. The late 19th century was a time of upheaval. Western powers began carving out spheres of influence across China. Cixi supported the self-strengthening movement, a series of reforms aimed at modernizing China's military and industry while preserving Confucian values. She famously oversaw the construction of the Summer Palace, partially funding it with money intended for the Navy. This decision haunted her reputation, but Cixi was balancing 2 world views, modern reform and dynastic survival. Every step forward felt like walking a tightrope. Cixi, pushback on reform and the Boxer Uprising. In 1898, the Guangxu emperor, then in his 20s, launched a radical reform program, the 100 Days Reforms. Cixi, alarmed by the speed and radical nature of the changes and the emperor's willingness to sideline her, fought back. She placed Guangxu under house arrest in the Summer Palace. Reformist leaders were arrested and executed. The Empress Dowager resumed full control. It was a harsh response, but Cixi believed that sudden reforms would lead to chaos and the fall of the dynasty. She chose order over experimentation. Critics called her a tyrant. Admirers saw her as the custodian of stability. In reality, she was both. As anti-foreign sentiment grew, the Boxer Uprising erupted in 1900. Initially, Cixi tried to suppress the movement, but as it gained traction, she changed course and endorsed it, hoping it could expel the foreign powers. It did not. The 8-nation alliance invaded China. The court fled to Xi'an. When the dust settled, Cixi negotiated the peace treaty. China was forced to pay massive indemnities, but Cixi saved the dynasty. Afterward, she made another pivot. She now embraced reform. From 1901 until her death in 1908, Cixi championed a series of new policies. She restructured the education system, replacing Confucian exams with modern learning. She reformed the military. She introduced new laws, encouraged industry, and even discussed developing a constitution. She also made strides toward gender equality, including banning foot binding in certain regions and establishing schools for girls. Though these changes came late, they laid the foundation for China's future transformation. In 1908, Cixi died at the age of 72, just one day after the death of the Guangzhou emperor. Theories exist that she ordered him poisoned to ensure the succession of her chosen heir, the infant Puyi. With her final act, she ensured the succession, though it was short-lived. 3 years later, the Qing dynasty collapsed in the Xinhai Revolution. Nonetheless, Cixi's impact endured. For nearly 50 years, she ruled from behind a curtain, behind the emperors, but never behind the times. Remember the woman behind the screen, Cixi, the empress who refused to disappear, who outlasted emperors, who turned concubinage into power. She ruled without a throne. She commanded without a crown. She endured.
Queen Isabella I of Castile. And now, my dear dreamers, we ride back to 15th century Spain to meet a woman who defied the rules, married by strategy, united a country, and launched the Age of Empires. Settle under your velvet blankets and let the story of Isabella I of Castile lull you, queen, warrior, and the mother of modern Spain. Isabella was born on April 22, 1451, in the small town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres. She was the second child of King John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal. Her early life was far from glamorous. Her father died when she was only 3, and the crown went to her half-brother, Henry IV. Henry's reign, to put it mildly, was unstable. Henry IV's reign, Isabella's half-brother, to put it mildly, was unstable. Nobles schemed, factions clashed, and questions of succession swirled like a dust storm. Isabella and her brother Alfonso were essentially political hostages, shuffled between castles. But Isabella watched it all. She grew up devout, clever, and reserved. She was not meant to inherit anything until fate, chaos, and her own iron will collided. As Isabella came of age, marriage proposals flowed, but each carried political risks. Henry IV tried to arrange a match for her to cement his shaky legacy. Isabella refused. She wanted control over her future. In an age when royal women were pawns, Isabella dared to be a player. In 1469, she chose Ferdinand of Aragon. They were first cousins, so they required a papal dispensation. They did not wait. They forged one and were married in secret. It was the start of one of the most consequential partnerships in history. Though young, Isabella and Ferdinand were a formidable pair. They agreed to rule jointly, each maintaining control over their own kingdoms, but presenting a united front. Henry IV died in 1474, triggering a succession crisis. His daughter, Juana, known as La Beltraneja, claimed the crown. Many believed she was not his legitimate child. Supported by Portugal, she challenged Isabella's claim. A brutal civil war ensued. Isabella led armies. She negotiated with nobles. By 1479, she emerged victorious. Juana was sent to a convent. Isabella was the undisputed Queen of Castile. But this was more than a personal triumph. It marked the start of the unified Spanish monarchy. With Ferdinand ruling Aragon and Isabella ruling Castile, Spain was not a single nation, but it was close. Isabella's reign was marked by an obsession with order. She crushed lawlessness among the powerful nobility. She reformed the justice system, established a professional police force known as the Santa Hermandad, Holy Brotherhood, and set up the Royal Council to centralize governance. Her goal was simple: to transform Castile into a modern, centralized monarchy. She also solidified the monarchy's role in the church.
With papal backing, she gained control over ecclesiastical appointments in Castile, ensuring that religious and royal authority worked in hand in glove. Religion was the cornerstone of her rule. Which brings us to 1492. It was a year of triumph, tragedy, and transformation. 1. Granada. After a 10-year war, Isabella and Ferdinand completed the Reconquista, conquering the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. The Catholic monarchs rode into the Alhambra as victors. Spain was now united under Christian rule. 2. The Edict of Expulsion. Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, giving Jews 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave Spain. It was a devastating moment. Thousands fled. Thousands were forced to renounce their homes and identity. It was an act of religious purification, but also a national loss. 3. Columbus. Finally, in August of that same year, 3 ships sailed west under the command of Christopher Columbus. Isabella, after years of hesitation, agreed to finance his voyage. He did not find Asia. He found the Americas. Isabella never saw the shores of the New World, but she was the monarch under whom that era began. Isabella was deeply concerned with how the native peoples would be treated. She issued instructions that they should be respected and peacefully converted. In theory, this was compassion. In practice, it was conquest. The seeds of empire were planted. The Spanish would soon colonize vast swaths of the Americas. Gold would flow to Spain. So too would war, rebellion, and exploitation. Isabella opened the door to empire, but empire has its own rules. Together, Isabella and Ferdinand became known as the Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. They established the Spanish Inquisition to root out heresy. It was brutal, effective, and long-lasting. Conversos from Judaism and Islam were scrutinized. Torture and execution became tools for enforcing the faith. This chapter of Isabella's reign is one of deep contradiction. She believed she was saving souls, but history remembers the pain as much as the piety. Isabella understood the power of family. She engineered strategic marriages for her children, Catherine to England, Juana to the Habsburgs. Her goal was to secure alliances that would encircle France and elevate Spain. But tragedy struck. Her only son, Juan, died at 19. Her daughter Isabella died in childbirth. Her Catherine's husband Arthur, Prince of Wales, died months after their marriage. Her daughter Juana descended into mental instability. Isabella's grand dynastic plan began to crumble. The dream of a stable, united, and Catholic Europe faded. Nevertheless, she persisted, writing a testament that outlined her hopes for Spain, her beliefs, and her unwavering faith. Isabella died on November 26, 1404. She had ruled Castile for 30 years. She shaped the map of Europe and the world. Her vision, faith, and willpower forged Spain into a global empire. She left behind a kingdom united, reformed, and powerful, but also wounded by intolerance and shadowed by the Inquisition. She was at once a hero and a zealot, a savior and a scourge, a saint and a sovereign. History remembers her because it cannot forget her.
Empress Theodora. Now we journey to the glittering yet treacherous world of Constantinople, where a former actress turned empress ruled alongside one of the Eastern Roman Empire's greatest emperors. Settle into the silk sheets. It's time to meet Empress Theodora, survivor, intriguer, saint, and co-ruler of Byzantium. Theodora was born around 500 CE in the vibrant city of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, known today as Byzantium. Her family was humble by imperial standards. Her father was a bear trainer at the Hippodrome, the city's bustling arena. When her father died young, her mother struggled to provide. In an era where class determined nearly everything, Theodora and her sisters had few options. They entered the world of performance. In Byzantium, this was a life on the fringes, more scandal than fame. Theodora was known for her wit, her beauty, and her stage presence. But what she learned from performing, the art of persuasion, charisma, and emotional control, would later serve her far better in the palace than on the stage. After a sojourn in North Africa, possibly as a courtesan or companion to a provincial official, she returned to Constantinople a changed woman. She embraced Monophysite Christianity, a branch of Christianity that taught Christ had a single divine nature. This put her in direct opposition to the Orthodox Church. But Theodora was not afraid of doctrinal politics. She used her court as a sanctuary for exiled bishops, sponsored monasteries that challenged imperial orthodoxy, and maintained a delicate religious balance. She was not afraid to disagree with Justinian publicly and privately, and yet their partnership endured. She had her own network, her own advisors, and her own religious vision. She was not just empress, she was a political force, a theological player, and a religious patron. Theodora's life was full of contradiction. She ruled in an empire that feared powerful women, and yet wielded immense authority. She insisted on compassion in a system built on hierarchy. She protected the vulnerable while maneuvering through the cutthroat court politics of Byzantium. She was respected and feared. Her enemies whispered that she was still an actress in disguise, a manipulator in pearls. But to those she helped, the women without power, the outcasts, the poor, she was hope, wrapped in royal robes. She was also a survivor. She outsmarted rivals, outlived enemies, and maintained power until the very end. Theodora died in 548 CE, probably of cancer. She was about 48 years old. Her death was a seismic loss. Justinian continued to rule, but never remarried. In law, architecture, and faith, he followed her vision as much as his own. In the great Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, her image remains. The mosaics show her in full imperial regalia, surrounded by court ladies, holding a chalice and stepping toward the altar. She is depicted not as a backdrop figure, but as a sovereign, regal, golden, powerful. She is one of the few women of her era whose voice, however filtered by historians, still resonates. She was never supposed to rule, but rule she did. Empress Suiko, Buddhism and the Yamato Nation. Now, dear dreamer, we journey to ancient Japan, to a time when emperors were gods and the islands were awakening to a new era. Light a lantern, sip some tea, and meet Empress Suiko, Japan's first reigning empress, a woman of grace, strength, and vision, who guided her nation through one of its most pivotal transformations. Suiko was born in 554 CE into the Yamato dynasty, the ruling house of Japan for generations. Though a princess, she was not initially destined to rule. In this era, Japan was fragmented, not yet a unified country, but a patchwork of powerful clans. Women at court wielded influence through marriage and diplomacy, but few ever wore the crown. She married her half-brother, Emperor Bidatsu, a common dynastic strategy. When Bidatsu died, she retired from court, as tradition dictated. But the waves of politics brought her back. Rival clans vied for influence, and the two most powerful clans, the Soga and the Mononobe, clashed not just over which prince should rule, but over religion.
Buddhism, recently introduced from Korea, was championed by the Soga clan. The traditionalist Mononobe rejected it. The conflict culminated in a brutal skirmish from which the Soga emerged victorious. It was they who turned to Nukatebe, Suiko's birth name, the widow, and elevated her to the throne in 593 CE. She took the regnal name Suiko and became Japan's first reigning empress, not regent, but sovereign. At the heart of Suiko's rule was her alliance with Prince Umayado, better known as Prince Shotoku, a young man of keen intellect and administrative genius. Shotoku was appointed as her regent. Together, they ushered in a new political and spiritual era. Shotoku is often remembered for the 17-article constitution of 604 CE, which laid down ethical and bureaucratic principles inspired by Confucian and Buddhist thought. Under Suiko and Shotoku, the imperial court began modeling itself on the Chinese Sui and Tang dynasties. Administrative ranks were formalized. Titles were given based on merit, not just heredity. Suiko dispatched diplomatic envoys to China, establishing Japan's place in the international order. These missions brought back monks, medicine, and writing. One of Suiko's greatest tasks was managing the uneasy marriage of Buddhism and native Shinto traditions. Suiko personally embraced Buddhism, but she did not ban Shinto. Instead, she framed Buddhism as complementary. Temples were built next to shrines. Suiko became a living bridge between the old and the new. Anne Boleyn, Intrigue, Love, and Downfall. Despite constant court intrigue, Suiko held steady. She was deliberately infrequent in her public appearances, but her presence was felt in every decree. She elevated the dignity of the throne without turning it into a tyranny. Under her rule, Japan became more organized, more literate, and more connected to the world. She ruled for 35 years, a remarkable span for any sovereign. In 628 CE, after more than 3 decades on the throne, Suiko abdicated. She had chosen a successor. Her era marked the first steps towards centralized government and the integration of Buddhism into the national identity. She governed by encouraging a balance between faiths, factions, and the future. Anne Boleyn was born in the late 15th century in Kent, into a family whose ambitions were nearly as deep as the royal bloodlines they sought to impress. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat. Anne was groomed to shine. At a young age, she was sent to the continent, where she received a richer, more sophisticated education than most English ladies of the time. She served at the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and later in France. It was there that Anne truly blossomed, immersing herself in French fashion, the arts, and courtly flirtation. By the time she arrived at the court of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn was poised, intelligent, and magnetic. Unlike her sister, Mary, who had been a royal mistress and forgotten, Anne demanded more. She refused to be another name in the king's ledger. If he wanted her, he had to make her his wife. Thus began one of the most infamous and transformational romances in European history. Henry VIII, already married to Catherine of Aragon, was captivated by Anne's spirit. She was not submissive, but confident, challenging, and teasingly elusive. For Anne, the stakes were impossibly high. She refused to yield until he placed the crown on her head. She would not be another discarded favorite. Henry pursued her obsessively, promising her everything. But Anne, calculating and cautious, refused to give in. For Henry, this devolved into desperation. He turned to the Pope for an annulment from Catherine, citing divine punishment for the lack of a living male heir. But the Pope, unwilling to anger Catherine's nephew Emperor Charles V, refused. So Henry did what any power-crazed monarch would do. He declared himself the new head of the Church of England, broke with Rome, and forced his nation to choose between obedience to the Pope and loyalty to its increasingly volatile king. In 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married. Shortly afterward, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony. But fate seemed to possess a cruel sense of irony. Later that year, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a brilliant, fiery child, destined to be one of history's most legendary monarchs. But Henry, at the time, was bitterly disappointed. He had risked his soul and torn his kingdom apart for Anne, and what he wanted, demanded, was a son. Anne's power, so swiftly won, began to slip away. Though she remained Henry's wife and queen, her position was never secure. She made many enemies at court, too principled, too influential, too much like the king himself in her refusal to play the role of the demure wife. Her second and third pregnancies ended in miscarriage. One tragically occurred after the shock of perhaps witnessing Henry fall during a jousting tournament, or upon hearing of his growing flirtation with a quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. The court that had once applauded her ascent now whispered of her downfall. By 1536, just 3 years after becoming queen, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges against her were shocking and suspiciously convenient: adultery, incest, treason. Her own brother was among those accused. The trial, as you might imagine, was less a legal proceeding than a royal execution in slow motion. Anne, ever eloquent and composed, fiercely defended herself, but it was clear that the verdict had been written long before the trial began. On May 19th, Anne Boleyn was brought to the scaffold. She wore a dark gown and a mantle of grace, her hair tucked under the infamous French hood that had become her signature. She gave her final speech, dignified, calm, and hauntingly serene, and made no accusation against the king. She even praised him, as was expected of a queen going to her death. And then, with one clean stroke of the French executioner's sword, she was gone. She was barely into her 30s. Anne Boleyn's story did not end with her death. It began there because the daughter she bore, Elizabeth, would rise to become one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known, and the reformation she precipitated with her marriage would echo for centuries, changing not just England, but the very landscape of Western religion. Anne was not a victim, not a villain, and not merely a queen. She was a revolution wrapped in silk and steel. She was a woman who dared to ask for more. And though the world tried to cut her down to size, her shadow spans all history. Elizabeth I, from outcast to golden age. Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7, 1533. Her arrival was not met with the joyous fanfare her parents desperately awaited, for she was not the boy for whom her father had torn his kingdom apart. She was a girl, a fragile, red-haired disappointment. Her mother, the brilliant Anne Boleyn, had risen like lightning through the court, but now that her womb had failed to produce the promised son, her political ground began to crumble. By the time Elizabeth was barely 3, she had lost everything that once secured her future. Her title as princess was revoked, her place in the succession declared illegitimate, and her mother executed on her father's command. From that point on, Elizabeth's childhood was shaped by a strange paradox. She was both royal and disposable. She was sent to live in remote houses, raised by stepmothers who came and went, and watched by a father who, though sometimes affectionate, could never look her in the eye without recalling the ghost of the wife he had destroyed. Yet despite her shaky standing, Elizabeth was educated beyond the expectations of her sex, tutored like a prince, not a lady. She was entrusted to tutors who cultivated her fierce intellect and taught her Latin, Greek, French, theology, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and history. By the time she was 10, Elizabeth could debate with scholars, translate ancient texts, and compose poetry. By 15, she was not only fluent in 6 languages, but had developed the acute skills of observation of one who knew that saying the wrong word at the wrong time could mean imprisonment or worse. When her father died in 1547 and her half-brother Edward VI took the throne, the court became a dangerous battlefield. Her sister, Mary, a zealous Catholic, ascended the throne in 1553, and Elizabeth almost immediately became a figure of suspicion, a symbol of Protestant resistance. Arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London on suspicion of supporting a rebellion she likely knew nothing about, she occupied the very rooms where her mother had once awaited execution. But Elizabeth did not break. She endured. She composed cautious, ambiguous letters, pleaded her innocence with enough sincerity to be believed and enough cunning to survive. And after several terrifying months of isolation, she was released under surveillance. When Mary died childless in 1558, Elizabeth rode into London not just as the last Tudor heir, but as a survivor, a woman who had outlasted the dangerous reigns of her father, brother, and sister, who had walked through the mouth of political and religious turmoil, relying only on her intellect, caution, and unrelenting belief that she was born for something greater. She was 25, and she was queen. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth knew that marriage was expected of her. But Elizabeth, ever the strategist, refused to cede her power to a man, refused to tie herself to the ambitions of foreign princes or domestic nobles, and instead cultivated an entire mythology around her persona as a sole female sovereign, declaring herself married to her kingdom, her crown, and her people. She spun the narrative of the Virgin Queen with such mastery that it became not a lack, but a divine virtue. She kept suitors on a string for decades. Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria. She used her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, a bargaining chip, and a cloak of independence. At court, she surrounded herself with men of wit, brilliance, and loyalty. William Cecil, her advisor, Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, and Robert Dudley, her beloved favorite. And it worked. Elizabeth's reign ushered in a period of relative stability, economic growth, and artistic flourishing that came to be known as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time when poets, playwrights, and philosophers thrived, when William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe turned the English language into something new, vital, and full of fire. She navigated the international waters with the same blend of charm and ferocity, supporting Protestant causes abroad, sponsoring explorers who grabbed new lands and filled English coffers with gold. And finally, provoked to the limit, she stood against the most powerful empire in the world. When the Spanish Armada sailed toward England in 1588, Elizabeth did not flinch. Instead, she donned a breastplate, rode to address her troops at Tilbury, and declared in one of the most iconic speeches in royal history that while she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England. And when the Armada was defeated, thanks not only to English bravery, but also storms and divine good luck, Elizabeth's legend was sealed. As the decades progressed, Elizabeth remained unmarried, childless, and increasingly isolated. Her old friends died, her favorites departed, her throne was secure, but her heart grew lonelier. She wore her crown like armor, a kind of royal theater, a spectacle to distract from the creeping fragility. And though she danced less, laughed less, and trusted less than ever, she never stopped ruling. She died in 1603, aged 69, and having reigned for 44 years, the last Tudor monarch, and arguably the greatest of them all. She left no heir, but she left a legacy. Elizabeth I was not supposed to be queen. She was born a disappointment, the daughter of a disgraced mother. But she forged herself into Gloriana, into the Virgin Queen, into a woman so powerful and so impossibly brilliant that entire generations would look back on her rule and call it the Golden Age.
Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt. Allow us to journey through the life and legend of Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt and one of history's most compelling figures. Her story is one of intellect, power, and romance. Close your eyes and enter a world of gilded palaces, secret political deals, and a woman who defied destiny to leave her mark on history. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the ruling Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had governed Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Unlike most of her ancestors, she embraced Egyptian culture, even learning to speak the native language, a rarity among Egypt's Greek rulers. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was an unpopular ruler. Upon his death, Cleopatra ascended the throne at just 18 years old, ruling alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. However, palace intrigue soon forced Cleopatra into exile. But she was not a woman to be easily defeated. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to reclaim her throne when Julius Caesar, Rome's most powerful general, arrived in Egypt. According to legend, she had herself secretly smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled in a carpet, making a dramatic and unforgettable entrance. Cleopatra's intelligence, charm, and political acumen captivated Caesar. With his military backing, she defeated her brother's forces, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile attempting to flee. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, and in 47 BCE, she gave birth to their son, Caesarion, Little Caesar. She traveled with him to Rome, cementing her alliance with Caesar. However, when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra returned to Egypt. Following Caesar's death, Rome plunged into civil war. The two dominant figures were Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general. Cleopatra allied herself with Antony, meeting him in 41 BCE under legendary circumstances. She sailed to the meeting on a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, enveloped in gold and perfume, enchanting Antony from their first encounter. Their relationship was not just romantic, it was political. Cleopatra needed Antony's support to maintain Egypt's independence, and he needed her wealth to fund his campaigns. Together, they ruled as the power couple of the ancient world. They had 3 children and formed an alliance that threatened Rome itself. Cleopatra envisioned an empire where Egypt and Rome could rule together, restoring the might of the East. In Rome, Octavian saw Cleopatra and Antony as a threat. He launched a propaganda campaign, painting Cleopatra as a scheming seductress who had bewitched Antony and sought to undermine Rome. The rivalry escalated into full-scale war. In 31 BCE, Octavian's forces met Antony and Cleopatra's fleet at the Battle of Actium. Their fleet was crushed, and their fate was sealed. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, where they made a final stand. Realizing defeat was inevitable, Antony fell upon his sword, mistakenly believing Cleopatra was already dead. When she found him dying, she held him in her arms as he took his last breath. Octavian marched into Egypt, determined to capture Cleopatra and parade her through Rome as a trophy. Rather than endure such humiliation, Cleopatra chose to take her own life. According to legend, she had an Egyptian cobra, an asp, secretly smuggled into her quarters and allowed it to bite her. Regardless of the veracity of the story,
She died on August 12, 30 BCE, at the age of 39. With her death, Egypt fell to Roman rule, marking the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last independent kingdom of ancient Egypt. Cleopatra's legacy is one of power, intellect, and resilience. She was not merely a seductress or a pawn in Rome's games. She was a shrewd politician, a brilliant linguist, and a woman who commanded respect in a male-dominated world.
The echo of legend and Theodora's legacy. Her story has been immortalized in art, literature, and film. From Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to Hollywood epics, her name remains a symbol of femininity, strength, and political cunning. Though her empire fell, her legend lives on, whispering through the sands of Egypt, in the ruins of Alexandria, and in the hearts of those who dream of power, love, and destiny. "I shall not be led in triumph," she is reputed to have said. Her reign was seduction and strategy, love and war, but above all, an unbroken will. Now we travel to the glittering yet treacherous world of Empress Theodora in Byzantine Constantinople, where a former actress turned empress ruled alongside one of the Eastern Roman Empire's greatest emperors. Settle in on the silk sheets. It's time to meet Empress Theodora, survivor, schemer, saint, and co-ruler of Byzantium. Theodora was born around 500 CE in the bustling city of Constantinople. Her family was humble by imperial standards. Her father was a bear trainer at the hippodrome. In a time when class determined almost everything, Theodora had few options. She entered the world of performance. In Byzantium, this was a world on the fringe. But what she took from performance, the art of persuasion, charisma, and emotional control, would later serve her far better in the palace. After a period in North Africa, possibly as a courtesan, she returned to Constantinople a changed woman. She embraced Monophysite Christianity and abandoned her old life for something greater. Her partner in power and love was Justinian. He was an ambitious man known for his legal brilliance. When he met Theodora, the attraction was instant, but also politically dangerous. Roman law forbade high-ranking officials from marrying actresses. Justinian didn't just break the law, he rewrote it. In 525 CE, he married Theodora. 2 years later, he became emperor. Theodora, beside him, was crowned as the Empress of the Romans. She sat on the throne as a co-ruler, her name etched beside his on imperial edicts. In 532 CE, political tensions in Constantinople exploded. In what became known as the Nico riots, mobs set fire to buildings and declared a new emperor. The city was burning. Justinian panicked. His advisors urged retreat. Theodora stood firm. In a speech that echoes through history, she told Justinian that the purple makes the noblest shroud, and that she would not flee. Her courage, her refusal to abandon the throne, rallied the court. With her resolve, Justinian ordered a counterattack. His generals marched into the hippodrome and slaughtered over 30,000 rebels. It was decisive, and it saved the empire. Theodora's influence extended far beyond palace drama. Under her guidance, Justinian enacted the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundational legal code. Theodora contributed laws protecting women, children, and the vulnerable. She championed laws that expanded women's rights to divorce and property, and outlawed forced prostitution. She also used her wealth to build monasteries, shelters, and hospitals. Religion in Byzantium was a battlefield. Theodora was a devoted Monophysite. She used her court as a refuge for exiled bishops and maintained a delicate religious balance. She was not afraid to disagree with Justinian publicly, and yet their partnership endured. She had her own network, her own advisors, and her own religious vision. She was not merely an empress, she was a political force, a theological player, and a religious patron. Theodora's life was full of contradictions. She ruled in an empire that feared powerful women, and yet wielded immense power. She insisted on compassion in a system built on hierarchy. She protected the vulnerable while maneuvering through the cutthroat court politics of Byzantium. She was respected and feared. Her enemies whispered that she was still an actress in disguise, a manipulator in pearls. But to those she helped, the women without power, the outcasts, the poor, she was hope wrapped in royal robes. She was also a survivor. She outsmarted rivals, outlived enemies, and held power until the very end. Theodora died in 548 CE, possibly of cancer. Her death was a seismic loss. Justinian continued to rule, but never married again. In law, architecture, and faith, he followed her vision. In the great basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, her image remains. She is depicted not as a background figure, but as a sovereign, regal, golden, powerful. She is one of the few women of her era whose voice, however filtered by historians, still resonates. She was never supposed to rule, but she did rule.